Welcome back to the Cultured Swine Chat. I'm your host and editorial director, Kyle Lamar Rice. Today we are talking luxury and consumer marketing, specifically Zara and Shein. Joining me is fashion creator and strategy director, Jay Choice Tibbetts. Jay, welcome.
Hello, thank you for having me. Very excited to chat.
I'm wondering if you can give us some background. Obviously, I know what you do and I'm a follower, but can you just give some background on what exactly it is that you do and how you got into this directory role?
Yeah, so I kind of like to say I have two parallel careers, but connectedly, I like to say I'm the social guy. So on kind of the corporate side, I work in like big business advertising at a global creative agency called Havas New York, and I'm the social media strategy director there. So I work across all verticals from financial services to pharma to beauty to education. It doesn't really, I don't discriminate in that regard. And I've been doing that for like almost a decade. But then on the other side, because of like my just love for fashion, I kind of started a blog very early on in my career, which has then progressed to me doing like what people would consider like influencer work, but where I kind of have a unique niche is that I kind of layer on the traditional like fashion influencer, fashion creator shtick with my understanding of kind of business strategy and looking at it from that lens. So it's a bit of kind of a 360 view of fashion, not just from like a styling and like visual creative perspective, but also from like a back end business perspective, consumer perspective, culture perspective.
Yes. This is why I think you are such the right person to talk about what we're going to dive into because obviously I watch your videos. I'm a fan of your work
Thanks.
and because it removes the vapidness of what fashion is and really gets at the heart of what's happening behind the scenes. It's the machine, it's the beast, it's everything
A
that
business.
goes
It's a big
into it's the
business.
business. Yes. So I want to dive in specifically to talk about Zara first because we've started seeing this shift in regular consumer marketing for fashion brands. H&M might have been the first that was maybe widely talked about when they started doing designer collaborations,
Yeah.
but this has been a beat that Zara has kind of always been on.
Hmm.
Specifically, their latest campaign, it's a capsule collection with French designer Ludwig de Saint-Cernin. It was
I
directed
always
by
get confused by the name too. I can never say it. I
yeah,
always just
it's
say
hard.
LDS.
LDS, yes, LDSS. Directed by Gordon von Steiner, who's also shot campaigns for Versace, Dolce& and Gabbana, and Vogue, and then featured Alex Consani and Amelia Gray, who are both very widely known models. Some might argue that Alex Consani is even a supermodel. Can you give me a bit of background and your perspective of when this campaign launched? What was your thoughts and what was just like, your initial reaction?
Well, first, my initial reaction was good for Ludwig. He's had a really interesting trajectory in fashion. I think he like was at Ann Demeulemeester for like one season before he like got nixed for what's not confirmed. But and like I've been a fan of his own brand because I love how he kind of takes kind of underground queer culture and nightlife and kind of brings it to like a fashion lens, which has been done by other designers in the past, but he does it with like a unique POV.
Mhm.
But I was interested that like Zara went with him as this evolution into designer collabs because I feel like Zara doesn't do that many collaborations. They've been doing more
Right.
in the past, but it seems like their strategy has always been very consistent because Zara has always done the big model fashion photography thing to sell very kind of like lower like middle market priced clothing.
Mhm.
They even do this. I remember reading a case study about even their store placements. Like the way that where they place their stores are always next to really high end stores, and that's very strategic because
Mhm.
they want to grab that same person who maybe might spend a bit of their money save up to go to like a designer store, but they can also get that same style because they have like an aesthetic POV. They can get it at Zara for a cheaper price, and like they're in that same kind of landscape.
Right.
And so like them going into now designer collaboration, similar to what H&M has done, made a lot of sense to me. I thought the rollout was smart. The models were picked were very like Ludwig brand aligned, and then
Mhm.
also for the target that they're trying to go for, seem like really on point. And I was interested in like I was like looking like, oh, when does this come out? I was
Right.
like, I was kind of interested in like what is this gonna look like? So yeah, I think that them evolving the brand to not just the Zara brand itself, but like tagging on these designer collaborators makes sense. Another thing too that I just read, like literally like a day or two ago, in this McKinsey and Business of Fashion State of Fashion report, is that a lot of these kind of like Zara's, H&M's, like mid-market clothing brands are
Mm-hmm.
starting to move up market to
Mm-hmm.
compete with the ultra fast fashion brands like the Sheins and the Temus, because they're trying to, because they can't compete with how low their prices are. But
Right.
then also the prices of luxury fashion have gotten so expensive that it's priced out a bunch of people who may have bought it in the past. So they're trying to capture that new market. And
Mm-hmm.
so by collaborating with designers, that's another way to kind of grab that audience.
Okay. I'm very curious on your thought. I wrote a newsletter, I think it was last week, specifically about like, is this a pattern that we've seen before? And I called out brands like Von Dutch, like Juicy
Yeah.
Couture, Baby Fat, all
Oh,
of
yeah.
these probably like lower tier consumer brands
Huh.
that were in the celebrity market and were marketed that way, but we're trying to put a visual around themselves of being part of the luxury consumer market, and it
Yeah.
ended up just failing, right? Like none of these businesses are what they used to be.
Hmm.
Zara is interesting in that they're doing it and they're doing it well
Huh.
without alienating that lower consumer base. And I'm just curious from your research and your understanding, like how is it that they're able to do it when so many brands have failed in the past?
That's a great question. I think, would you agree that H&M has been able to do it successfully too? I feel like H&M has been able to, because they continuously have like the designer collaborations that
Hmm.
sell out and have started. And actually they started the entire model with Karl Lagerfeld. Like I
Yeah.
remember like reading his biography. It's great, called Paradise Now. Recommend it for
Hmm.
anyone who's interested in a nerd. But it talks about how like before he did that first collaboration with them, people were like, "Don't do this."
Hmm.
I mean, like, everyone in the industry told him this was like the worst decision ever because it was, people couldn't like think that that luxury and middle market could live in the same place. We
Right.
now know that that can totally happen. It just has to be done with a very like strategic and smartly executed rollout and
Hmm.
plan. And I think part of the reason why Zara is able to do it is because Zara has like the scale too. I
Right.
think that's another reason why H&M is able to do it. Like they're both huge businesses. Those other ones you mentioned, Baby Fat, Von Dutch, like there just isn't the scale to have the amount of product to give the breadth to all of those consumers,
Hmm.
but also have like the level of kind of media output and like messaging
Hmm.
scale to and content to
Right.
appeal to all those people too. It's so I think that the scale I think would be the number one answer.
Hmm. I want to hear more about your comparison and contrast of H&M and M and Zara because I would maybe disagree that H&M is doing it effectively in the way that Zara is doing it. So I want to hear more about how you're thinking about those two and like what you think is successful with both and
Mm.
perhaps where there's weaknesses.
Yeah, well, I just think the success for H&M comes to the fact that they're still doing them.
Mm.
like every year, there's at least one or two. Like we just had Glenn Martin's, we had Mugler's in the past, we had Jean Baptiste Duvali's, which I literally remember waiting in line for at like 6 in the morning
Mhm.
to get a piece because it was the first time Jean Baptiste Duvali had done men's. We had the Balmain one, which I remember was like right when I moved to New York, and that one was crazy. Like I didn't go to that one, but I just remember like hearing about it. And so the fact that they continue to do them and they continue to sell out,
Mhm.
it to me tells me that it's successful. And there's always a lot of really like big buzz around it as well. And then, and with Zara, it's like new. Like I literally, the only other collaborations I can think of at the top of my head that Zara has done was the first one where I realized like, oh, Zara even does collaborations. But I think they did one with Good American, Khloe
Mhm.
Kardashian's brand,
Mhm.
and they did that, and then they also did it with this. I'm forgetting who the name of the designer was, but I just remember because within the collection they had like men's skirts, and it was like the first time I saw like a man's skirt outside of like the capital F fashion space, like in more
Mhm.
like a mid market clothing brand. But both of those have were in like the last few years.
Yeah.
So I think they're continuing to like roll it out, but those past ones I feel like have been fairly successful for them. But even saying it, I feel like this LDSS one is the one that I've heard the most buzz about.
Mhm.
And I think that's it's a bit of like an inflection point for them, where I think if this is successful from like the sales numbers, because it feels like it's been successful from like the media attention around it, but if the
Yeah.
sales confirm that, I think we'll be seeing a lot more of them.
Okay. My my thought process, and you tell me if I'm wrong. In some way, I wonder if Zara's success has to do with their branding. So
Uh,
they underwent a rebrand. This is
yeah,
2019, and the agency that they had do it is Fabian Baron. He used to work for Interview Magazine. He used to work for Vogue and Harper's Bazaar. Like he is the person who kind of established what fashion design and
visuals.
art direction looked
Yeah,
like in the early 2000s. And to have him come on and give Zara a complete rebrand, that's the site, that's the logo, it's everything. It all like that right there and then it showed a pivot towards like them Zara's doing something larger than just consumer fashion.
uh,
Because of that shift, I wonder if there's stickiness. Like for me, for example, I traditionally like would not shop at H&M. I
uh,
might buy a designer collection when they do the
uh,
designer collections, but I'm not going to H&M and shopping
yeah,
after I like buy that. If it weren't for me knowing about the horrific work standards that Zara has and like just the history,
yeah.
there's a strong possibility that I would actually shop the brand post collaboration.
Uh,
So there's like a stickiness there. I'm
yeah.
wondering if you think the same or if you think that H&M still has that stickiness for non-luxury consumers.
Well, so actually, that point you made about H&M not shopping H&M outside the designer collection, I'm exactly the same. Like I like
Mm.
literally only get it for the designer collections or their what's their premium line. They
Mhm.
have like an H&M something else, but like I have this one white turtleneck sweater that is from that H&M like designer like tier collection, but it's not a collaboration. It's just like their designer tier. So it's like a bit pricier, but it is so good. And every time I wear it, I get so many compliments. I'm like, it's
Yeah.
H&M. But and I feel like H&M is starting to do better at that because Zara is so good at it. Zara has been able to kind of like overlay the quality, overlay the design standards. Also, Zara, like we can't forget, like once again, the scale. And this is something that H&M with their new, I think it's a new CEO, has been talking about that they're trying to help with is that what I know seems crazy because they're both fast fashion brands, but the H&M has said that they're not fast enough compared
Mm.
to the competitors like Zara. They
Mhm.
are just way behind in terms of how they get designed to market,
Yeah.
and Zara is so much faster. And so I think that also is what gives the stickiness of people shopping outside of the collaborations.
Mhm.
And people are doing that shopping at Zara like that because they could always get that kind of like fresh new look, and they could get something that they like saw. Like it's like Zara will literally have the design in the store a few weeks after it's been on the runway. Like the
Right.
production hadn't happened from
Right.
like the actual designer that created it. And so people like that. People want the style. But now that they're overlaying this like actual designer collaboration component where you get like the shared equity, like or borrowed equity from the like capital F fashion space, I think it'll just continue to kind of scale it. But the point about H&M, I think, is correct. I think like H&M is had their success really is from their history of designer collaborations, but I think from their just baseline
Mhm.
clothes, they could be doing a bit better. But they've been very public about talking how they're trying to like up level that.
Right. Right. One conversation that's been dominating recently is the investment in quality pieces over time, which is something
Uh,
that you just said. But like taking it the next step further, that's one of the reasons people historically used to buy into luxury is the
uh,
idea that it's a higher quality piece. Recently, we've understood that that's perhaps not always the case. Miu Miu is a big violator of this, where they
yeah.
consistently have influencers speak out against their quality despite the price tag.
Like a huge part of like the LVMH machine of
Mhm.
like, and just actually luxury in general has to do with time. It's like one
Right.
of the reasons they bought Tiffany, because Tiffany, even though it's American, there's nothing really luxurious about America. But but what Tiffany had, and like I was listening to their CMO talk about this, was about or was it their C note was their CFO was talking about how like they bought it because of the time, because
Mhm.
how old it is. Like
Mhm.
that in itself has a crazy amount of value that can be turned into dollars. Um, and so yeah, this idea of going back to your question around how does Zara hold on to its core demo while also moving up market.
Mhm.
That's actually just a general business challenge. I think that like it literally it's not just a fashion specific challenge, it's just the business challenge in general because it's like here we go. This is actually a good way to put it. I talk about this when I teach students sometimes because we talk about like why do brands risk having doing like these big rebrands that can
Mhm.
like completely alienate a audience. And the reality is there's this book called, I think it's Byron Sharp, How Brands Grow. And it talks about this like diminishing returns on growth, where like it's better for you to get a new person to shop one time, like someone to go from buying it 0 times to once or once to twice, than to get someone who already is shopping to buy like 5 more times because it's like a long tail. So
Mhm.
it's like there's way more people over on the left hand side buying 0 to 1 times. So if you can capture that person, you'll continue to grow because one, the other person, the growth isn't going to be the same because there's just less of them who are buying more, but also those people will die. Like that's another thing. Like that, we talk about this all the time. Like with the brands that I work with on the like advertising agency side outside of fashion, it's like that is why brands are always trying to go for a younger audience because like the
Mhm.
younger audience typically has never shopped from the brand before. They're not shopping as much, and two, they're going to live longer. So,
Mhm.
and like this is exactly what happened with the Bud Light situation. And
Mhm.
they just manage it terribly. But like
Mhm.
that is what they're doing. It's like they're like, okay, well, and you add on top of that, the older you get and the more you're drinking, it's typically not positive. So,
Right.
so like they're because that's why these alcohol brands are trying so hard to like capture Gen Z, which is hard because we know Gen Z isn't drinking as much. Everyone's smoking the ganj. But yeah, I think like that is I think another component, and it's so it becomes a risk reward situation, and
Right.
the risk is bigger than the reward if you can pull it off.
Right.
You just have to make sure that you are pulling off getting those people who have never bought from the brand or have only buying once to buy one more time.
Well, this kind of segues into the second half of this conversation, which is Shein. They opened their first physical store in Paris with the comment that they are committed to revitalizing city centers, which was met with backlash by Parisian residents, protesters, and including politicians. Senator Ian Brozat, Minister Roland Lescure, and Deputy Mayor of Commerce Nicolas Bonnet all spoke out against this, but I do think it gets to a point of what you're saying is that movement up market.
Mhm.
And now we're talking about very different scales. Zara, they've kind of been positioning themselves for this for a while. Shein is known for being a very, very low tier consumer market.
Yeah.
They have very low barriers to entry. To now scale into one of the largest luxurious markets in the world in Paris,
Mhm.
do you have any initial thoughts? What is your gut reaction, and how do you think that can work?
I think all of these things are connected because the market or the consumer base is not so fragmented anymore.
Hmm.
The person who's buying from Shein, Zara, and Celine are no longer different people. It
Hmm.
can be the same person buying all those three things.
Hmm.
And that's like a very different way of purchasing and like purchasing power from that person, especially as you get to younger audiences. Like I'm really fascinated by like the world of dupes, which is just a new word for a knockoff. But
Hmm.
this idea that it's no longer embarrassing and shameful to buy the dupe, and people who actually buy a lot of designer product will go out and buy the dupe or the full-on fake from like that what's that place called DH Gate, like,
Hmm.
and they'll like be proud about it. Like
Hmm.
that is a totally new consumer mindset that I think these brands are starting to consider. So by Shein going into a market like Paris that is very like fashion,
Hmm.
the reality is that people are questioning the quality of like luxury fashion brands. There's a whole eat the rich mentality in general. So people are kind of afraid to outwardly display signs of like logos and things that are associated with like elite or like privileged status. And everybody's trying to save money.
Hmm.
So she has the scale and the design capacity to output those type of designs. So being in a place like Paris, and because if it works, that can trickle down to everywhere else. Like if it works in Paris and like they can get Parisians to stop shopping at Shein, that will change the idea of Shein being this kind of like, oh, I'm just going to purchase it online and no one will know.
Yeah.
No one will know it's from Shein because it just looks good and I'll look good.
Right.
And so I think using a market like Paris as the first market was a really interesting strategic choice. I'd also love to know, but it has to be true because like no, these things are so expensive to pull off. So there's like so much research and stuff happening on the back end. Parisians must be shopping a lot from Shein anyway. And so that goes back to this idea of like they're trying to, it's a perception shift exercise because they must know that people are already shopping from Shein in Paris. It's just they're doing it from the comfort of their own home and nobody's seeing that it's Shein because it's like private. And so if they already know that consumer is shopping in that location, if they can get them to now go into the store, then it has that halo effect of we're not this kind of shameful ultra fast fashion, like super kind of ethically questionable
right.
brand.
Right. I mean, it's interesting to that point. So I did mark down what their global sales are and like what their largest markets are for 2024.
Huh?
The US is clearly number one at 28.2%, and then it immediately drops to Germany at only 6.6, followed by UK at 6, and then France is fourth at 5.4% of their
Okay.
global sales. So I think you're hitting it on the head of there is a perception shift. Obviously, that market's growing. The European market in totality is growing. But for I just find it fascinating in the question of like I'll use Calvin Klein as an example.
Mm-hmm.
When we talk about a basic white tee now,
Mm-hmm.
more often than not, we look at lower barrier to entry brands like Calvin Klein as still being the best of the best. Fashion editors use Calvin Klein for their white tees.
Yeah.
Very rarely do we use maybe a brand like Realtree, which is known for hunting, but also makes pretty decent white tees.
Yeah.
We immediately go to Calvin Klein. Now, Calvin Klein was established and wasn't around during a time where social media is so rampant and everyone can talk about anything on the internet, versus Zara and Shein are now in a different marketing segment where anyone can go on the internet, and specifically Shein, where they almost have this duality happening where one, you have a bunch of people shopping products and then doing hauls, but
Uh-huh.
then two, people shopping products and then talking about the poor quality of those products.
Uh-huh.
How do you think that, because I think you're right in the sense like there can be a perception shift, and Calvin Klein is kind of like living example that that can happen,
Uh-huh.
but he did it in an era where social media just didn't exist, so it was so much easier.
Yeah.
How does a brand like Shein or Zara that already has these like very tainted legacies that
Yeah.
a lot of people know about, like how do they do that today?
It is a challenge because there's a lack of because really what we're talking about is lack of control and
Hmm.
like lack of like story ownership. And the fact that a lot of times it's a smaller group with with a bigger microphone, like a megaphone. So like I remember doing a project actually for Temu. And I was looking at kind of some data and I had just come out of a project for another brand that was like really big on sustainability.
Hmm.
And it was like it's this thing between like action and what we say and what we do.
Hmm.
And so it's like younger consumers are so adamant about sustainability, but they're also the biggest shoppers of ultra fast fashion brands.
Right.
So it's like there's this like weird duality here. So like, and I think so going back to the point of like lack of control, it's like, yeah, from the back end, they can know that the numbers are numbering and
Hmm.
like people are buying the product. But when it comes to the outward expression of it, it's like, how do we control the narrative? And I think we saw like Shein try to do that with that influencer trip they did like a few years ago.
Yes.
And like that was kind of a flop. And so I feel like everyone's still kind of trying to figure it out. Yeah, it's a new space. Like you said, it's like Calvin Klein is operating in a world where this didn't exist.
Hmm.
And you had the traditional press as the gatekeepers, quote unquote, to get your message out. And there was a level of control around it. Now it's just so much more open. And so we're just starting to see how brands start to deal with that.
Right.
So much of capital F fashion is about perception and like image management.
Hmm.
But the reality is a lot of the VICs and the ultra high net worth people are not necessarily what the brand want to portray. Like
Right.
they're like to put it the most appropriately. Like I actually did some content around the whole Jeff Bezos, Lauren Sanchez being kind of the main sponsor of the Met. And someone mentioned how like it's gonna be so tacky now. And I'm like, let me tell you, Lauren Sanchez is 10 times less tacky than the average VIC at any brand.
Right.
Like, and those are the people who are make the backbone of the fashion. The backbone of the fashion industry is made by those people. So
Hmm.
now it's like you like are trying to prioritize this like ultra high net worth VIC client who doesn't necessarily fit your brand image, but you want to make sure like they feel like they're a part of the brand world. Then you're also trying to like hold on to like the online discourse with like all of these creators who like if you do something bad, there's opportunity for them to say something and millions of people see it. So you want to make sure like they're on your good side or you're on their good side. And then you have another whole like traditional image producing and like traditional comms of the
Hmm.
brand too. And like, how do you bridge all those three things is the challenge that I think the industry is trying to figure out. And I'm watching very closely to see how they do.
Right. As you should, as you should. Last question. I want to circle back to, does pivoting into marketing your brand as a luxury product work? And does it have legs? And specifically I want to talk about H&M. In 2019, they and like they never advertised this, but the Business of Fashion came out with this report on like truly recyclable fashion because a lot of people will use that comment or like that tagline, but it doesn't really cover the basis of like what is considered truly recyclable. And the report basically said that truly sustainable recycled fashion, where you're breaking down the product and recreating something new solely from that product, there was only two companies in the world at the time that could actually do that. One was owned by a university, I can't remember which one. The other was owned by H&M.
Oh,
And I found that incredibly fat. Maybe there was three. There might have been three. But the fact that H&M was one of the sole owners of this technology,
huh.
it, I was like, there's a really compelling story there, especially for this younger audience that is so interested in true sustainability, but like you said, still buys.
Yeah.
And they never quite leaned into it. It was also around the same time that they started pulling back on all of their brick and mortar in the US and like we're cutting back on the number of stores. And you could tell that they were slimming down their product selection, but they never fully hit it on the head of, on top of doing these two things, like we're slowing down production, we're limiting the number of stores to focus on quality, and in addition to quality, like truly earth conscious, sustainable pieces.
Yeah.
I'm wondering if, because they never leaned into it, if you've ever seen another brand or experienced backlash towards that, or is it something where brands are still hesitant to kind of lean on that messaging, and why is that?
Well, I didn't know that about H&M, but that tracks because I always say that like whenever people try to take a dunk on H&M, I do say that of all the fast fashion brands, they're the most supportive and aligned to the capital F fashion industry.
Hmm.
They're the most active in the things they try to do around sustainability. And they have the most range in terms of what they provide. You can get like your t-shirt that costs like $2.99.
Hmm.
Uh, or you can go to Cost, which is people forget is owned by H&M, or you can
Oh,
get
I
your
didn't know that.
oh yeah, no. This is like that's yeah. So Cost is literally what it literally like H&M is actually an incredibly smart business. Like yeah, so Cost is owned by H&M and it is their kind of premium collection, like premium line. But the thing is, because H&M is so associated with ultra fast fashion, they
Mhm.
needed to like literally separate the entire company and create an entirely new company to do that. And this is actually, and that kind of goes back to your point of why don't they go forward with that messaging? And I think it's because it's a perception thing. People think H&M and they think they lump it with the Sheins, the Temus, the Zaras, which all have terrible practices. When in reality, they're actually doing much more in
Mhm.
terms of like the sustainability efforts. They're like um, scale of audiences they appeal to, their support of the fashion industry like at large.
Mhm.
You don't see H&M like fully stealing designs like you do from the other brands. And they clearly have good relationships with the brands because they continue to do these really kind of high level collaborations. And so I think that's the issue. It's like it's a communication, like marketing issue.
Mm-hmm.
And because at the end of the day, fast fashion and sustainability are kind of like opposed.
Yeah.
They're kind of opposed to each other. But part of that, people may get mad at me for saying this, but part of that is a consumer issue.
Mm-hmm.
It's like actually, if it's more of the behavior that's been created by the fast fashion industry that you need to constantly be buying clothes, that's actually what makes it unsustainable. But like with H&M, if you're buying like maybe a few things once a season, and with all the sustainability efforts they do internally, like that is actually a sustainable business model and a sustainable like environmental way forward for like the consumer. But the issue is that as consumers, we're so primed to constantly be buying things all the time.
Mm-hmm.
And then that's where it becomes unsustainable, because if the business has to produce so many clothes like that fast, they're already not like the most kind of sustainable. It's not like super handcrafted. Like it's coming from 20 different factories all over the world. And fashion already is one of the biggest polluters.
Right.
So it's like it takes two to tango, I like kind of like to say. But to answer your initial question, I know we're in a circle. I think the issue is the fact that H&M is so associated with fast fashion because it was one of the first. Like I think people forget that like the whole fast fashion industry is incredibly new,
Mm-hmm.
and like it started with ZARA, with H&M, and then or Forever 21 too. You can't forget them. And then now we have a whole separate actually category of ultra fast fashion with your Temus, with your Sheins.
Mm-hmm.
And so everything's just moving really quickly. And I think the brands need to figure out how to communicate their differences and like their benefits around like sustainability and all those things that people care about in a way that is both clear and effective.
Gotcha. That makes sense.